For more than 7 decades, this recording remained buried in darkness, locked away in catalog silence, erased from every known biography, and scrubbed from the historical record. They told us the tape was lost forever, that no such recording ever existed, that the story itself was nothing more than whispered folklore among believers and skeptics alike. But deep beneath the first spiritual temple of Boston, inside a vault that had remained sealed since the Eisenhower administration, we discovered something that would challenge everything we thought we knew about the boundary between life and death. A 7-inch reel bearing only a date scrawled in fading ink, February 12, 1953. The voice captured on that magnetic tape speaks with a calm precision that carries within it the weight of terrible knowledge, the unmistakable cadence of Arthur Augustus Ford, the most controversial medium of the 20th century, speaking not to an audience or a circle of believers, but to himself alone, delivering a confession that was never meant to reach human ears. The discovery came entirely by chance when temple trustees attempted to digitize their deteriorating archives, expecting to find nothing more than decades of forgotten sermons and administrative records. What they uncovered instead was not merely a voice from the past, but a potential threat to the foundations of institutional religion, to the bedrock assumptions of scientific materialism, and to the comforting certainty that death represents a final, irreversible threshold. Arthur Ford was no carnival fortune teller or theatrical charlatan seeking fame through elaborate deception. Born in 1896 in the small Florida town of Titusville, he began his adult life as a minister in the Disciples of Christ, a man of conventional faith until a near-death experience during the devastating influenza pandemic of 1918 pulled him inexorably into the shadowy world of psychic phenomena. By the early 1920s, Ford had already established a reputation that troubled both believers and skeptics, delivering messages from the deceased that were so startlingly specific, so verifiable in their intimate details, that even his harshest critics struggled to dismiss him as a mere fraud. But it was in 1932 that his name became synonymous with one of the most sensational paranormal claims of the modern era. During a seance attended by respected journalists from major newspapers, Ford allegedly established contact with the spirit of Harry Houdini himself, the great escape artist and fierce debunker of fraudulent mediums who had died 6 years earlier. Through Ford, the deceased magician supposedly delivered a secret phrase known only to his grieving widow, a message that had been agreed upon as proof of genuine posthumous communication. The story exploded across the front pages of the New York Times and newspapers around the world, stunning the public and forcing the scientific establishment into an uncomfortable silence that spoke volumes about their inability to explain what had transpired. Behind the scenes, far from the glare of publicity, Ford began quietly collaborating with some of the most brilliant minds of his generation. Physicists intrigued by the possibility of consciousness existing beyond the physical brain, neurologists studying the electrical patterns of dying minds, and even wartime cryptographers fascinated by the prospect of decoding signals from another plane of existence. Among his most significant contacts was an experimental psychologist with high-level military clearance who introduced Ford to classified frequency studies involving human brain activity, research that would remain hidden from public scrutiny for decades. Another collaborator, a pioneering researcher at Duke University's newly established parapsychology laboratory, provided Ford with access to recording equipment sensitive enough to detect the most minute variations in electrical brain activity during deep trance states. These were not theatrical seances designed to impress paying customers, but rigorous data collection sessions conducted with scientific precision. The recovered tape begins with the soft mechanical click of an old recording device engaging, followed by the gentle hiss of magnetic tape moving across playback heads, and then Ford's voice emerges from the static, measured and deliberate. "They said not to release this," he begins, his words carrying the weight of profound isolation, "that it would undo everything we've built, that people would lose their minds if they knew the truth." He explains that he is alone in the room, that the recorder is running, and that this message is intended for whoever possesses the courage to listen in some distant future, if anyone still believes in the act of truly hearing. What follows defies every expectation of theatrical mysticism or religious performance. There are no dramatic flourishes, no mystical incantations, no appeals to ancient spirits or otherworldly powers. Instead, Ford methodically describes a pattern he began observing during his deepest trance states, a phenomenon he termed harmonic dislocation, moments when the electrical frequencies of his brain activity would mysteriously align with those of a second, unidentifiable field of energy. The process was remarkably similar to tuning a radio receiver, he explains with scientific detachment. Endless static and interference, and then suddenly, clarity would emerge. A voice that was unmistakably not my own, always faint but absolutely distinct. Ford began systematically cataloging every variable that might influence these extraordinary alignments. The precise time of day, levels of geomagnetic activity, his body temperature, the specific phase of his brainwave patterns. Most remarkably, he describes collaborating in secret with two engineers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who developed what he called a frequency isolator, essentially a modified Faraday cage connected to experimental vacuum tube amplification equipment designed to eliminate all external electromagnetic interference and isolate only those mysterious signals originating from within the sealed chamber. Our goal was elegantly simple, yet terrifyingly profound, Ford explains. We were attempting to subtract the influence of the living. The most disturbing revelation on the tape is not what Ford claims to have heard from beyond, but what he insists he scientifically proved. He describes monitoring the brain activity of a terminally ill volunteer from Massachusetts General Hospital during their final moments of life, using the most advanced electroencephalographic equipment available. According to Ford's account, mere seconds after clinical death was declared, when all measurable brain function should have ceased entirely, a residual electrical pattern continued to manifest, not random neural noise but organized, purposeful signal activity that displayed rhythmic, repeating characteristics containing what he described as semantic clusters, recognizable patterns that suggested meaning and intention. Ford claims that his team successfully extracted phoneme-like elements from this posthumous neural noise, and when these fragments were processed through an early vocoder-like system, a partial message emerged from the electromagnetic chaos. We distinctly heard a human name spoken clearly, he states with quiet conviction, followed by a simple but profound phrase, "I am not gone." After a long pause filled only with the whisper of turning tape, he continues, "I understand how this must sound to rational minds, but I also understand the undeniable reality of what our instruments recorded." At this point, Ford's clinical tone shifts towards something more reflective and deeply personal. He admits to being terrified of releasing these findings to the world, describing how he approached Duke University with his data, only to be quietly but firmly instructed never to speak of his discoveries again. "They told me it would destabilize foundational belief structures," Ford says, his voice heavy with bitter disappointment, "that it would embolden dangerous elements in society, that it wasn't legitimate science despite our rigorous methodology, but it was science, the purest kind." The final moments of the recording are almost too quiet to distinguish from the ambient hiss of the aging tape. Ford speaks slowly, as if exhausted by the weight of his secret knowledge, or perhaps aware that this confession represents his final opportunity to share what he has learned. "There is a signal that persists beyond physical death," he whispers into the darkness. "It does not cease when the heart stops beating. It does not belong to the dying body, and we may have only just begun to learn how to properly listen to its message." Then silence falls, broken only by the mechanical click of the recording device disengaging, and the reel stops turning. What are we to make of this extraordinary testimony? Was Ford suffering from delusions brought on by decades of immersion in the paranormal? Or did he, working in his obscure corner where mid-century mysticism intersected with cutting-edge science? The voice on this tape does not plead for belief or acceptance. It simply exists as documented evidence, digitized, and preserved for posterity. And once you have heard Arthur Ford's final confession, you cannot unhear the implications of what he claimed to discover in those hidden frequencies that surround us all. They called it the radio mind experiment, though officially it never existed at all. No journal articles bear its name, no patents claim its discoveries, no blueprints survive in any archive. Yet in a forgotten vault beneath Boston, alongside a crackling 1953 recording, hand-drawn schematics tell a different story. Signal ranges mapped with obsessive precision, trance durations measured to the second, spectrogram analyses from reel-to-reel tape decks, their ink faded but their implications eternal. This was the convergence of spiritualism and electrical engineering, of the emerging science of brainwaves, and the ancient mystery of what lies beyond death. It was not magic they sought to capture, it was measurement itself. Arthur Ford was not working alone in this impossible pursuit. In the shadow years following World War II, an alliance formed in secret, bound by questions too dangerous for daylight. Ford, the renowned medium whose trances defied explanation. Dr. Elizabeth Warburg, from Duke's Parapsychology Laboratory, where the boundaries of science stretched thin. Henry Ellison, former Army Signal Corps engineer, his hands still steady from wartime precision. And Dr. Alan Vaughan, a Navy psychologist whose fascination with altered states had quietly severed his government ties. They met not in sterile laboratories or university halls, but in repurposed churches and empty schoolhouses, once even in the basement of a New Haven funeral home, where death felt less like an ending and more like a frequency waiting to be tuned. Their mission crystallized around a single, haunting question: does consciousness leave a measurable imprint after death? Their method married the precision of early electroencephalography with radio frequency interference mapping, all calibrated to Ford's documented ability to enter self-induced trance states that resembled deep hypnosis yet produced detectable physical correlates that defied conventional understanding. Ford called these sessions synesthetic alignments, moments when the boundaries between mind and matter seemed to dissolve entirely. Using vacuum tube oscilloscopes borrowed from MIT's electronics department and primitive field strength meters, the team began documenting anomalies that chilled them to their core. Brief spikes in electromagnetic readings appeared not during Ford's trances, as they expected, but at the precise moment their subjects flatlined. They eliminated every possible source of interference, constructing shielded rooms with lead-lined doors, conducting sessions during local power blackouts when the electromagnetic spectrum fell silent. Still, the signal persisted, defiant and inexplicable. Ford recounts one subject who would haunt his memories forever, a blind woman in her 70s who had lost both sons to the war's hungry machinery. During her final recorded session, moments before death claimed her, she whispered a phrase in perfect German: "Komm zurück, come back." The woman had never studied the language, had never traveled beyond her small New England town. But when Ford entered his trance seconds later, his vocal cords began vibrating involuntarily under the team's watchful instruments. The same words emerged: "Komm zurück." The identical pitch. The identical cadence. Something had passed through. "We were terrified," Ford admits in the transcript, his voice carrying the weight of discovery and dread. This was no cold reading, no parlor trick refined through practice. This was transduction. Something had crossed over from one state to another, using channels we could barely comprehend. And perhaps the most chilling documentation, Ford details a session with a dying subject who had consented to posthumous transmission testing. The team constructed what they called a receiver box, an antenna array mounted within a vacuum-sealed isolation cabinet, lined with soundproofing and copper mesh to eliminate any earthly interference. The device was programmed to begin recording the moment the subject's heartbeat ceased. Within 12 seconds of death, an unexplained signal emerged at 17.2 Hz, below the threshold of human hearing, yet captured with crystalline clarity by their analog equipment. The pattern defied randomness. It followed a Fibonacci sequence of pulses, a natural mathematical code that spoke of intelligence rather than chaos. When slowed and frequency shifted, it resembled early attempts at machine-generated voice synthesis. Warburg believed it represented vocal data somehow preserved beyond biological death. Vaughan interpreted it as psychic residue, consciousness leaving its electromagnetic fingerprint. Ellison suspected an unknown terrestrial frequency source, perhaps even leaked Cold War communications. But Ford believed something far more profound. It was proof of presence itself, evidence that awareness persists in forms we are only beginning to understand. A visiting physicist from Bell Laboratories, learning of their work through mutual contacts, confronted Ford with words that would echo through decades. "Do you want to break the world? You're standing on a bridge with no guardrails. If what you're claiming is true, it doesn't prove heaven exists. It destroys the very foundation of objective reality." But Ford wasn't seeking heaven or hell or divine judgment. He pursued the answer to a question that had consumed him since 1918, when Spanish flu left him delirious in a hospital bed where he claimed to see his deceased brother standing at the foot of his bed. Was it just my fevered brain creating phantoms, he wondered, or was it genuine transmission across the boundary we call death? The real breakthrough arrived in 1951 during a multi-day session spanning 3 states. 3 dying patients, each isolated in different rooms, monitored through telephone relays and synchronized tape recordings. The moment the final patient died, Ford, hundreds of miles away, fell into spontaneous trance without prompting. In that instant, each of the 3 recorders registered an identical shortwave burst, lasting exactly 3.4 seconds, centered at 14.7 Hz. A signal that should have been impossible across such distances without conventional transmission, yet one that perfectly matched the spectral fingerprint of their previous sessions. This was not proof in the strictest scientific sense. It could not be replicated under laboratory conditions. But it was something unprecedented, something that challenged the very nature of consciousness and death. The following year, external pressures scattered the team like leaves before a storm. Warburg left Duke under administrative pressure. Vaughn disappeared into a private think tank, forbidden to discuss non-conventional research. Ellison vanished into classified Cold War defense contracts. Ford faced excommunication from his own spiritualist church if he continued the work. In the tape, Ford speaks without bitterness, but not without profound sorrow. I thought that if we could prove the soul as frequency, not as metaphor, but as measurable electromagnetic field, we might finally understand what it truly means to be alive at all. Then he pauses, his voice heavy with the weight of abandoned discovery. But perhaps it's not meant to be known yet. Perhaps there are doors that can open too early, truths that arrive before the world is ready to receive them. His voice trembles not with fear, but with exhaustion, the toll of carrying knowledge that no one was prepared to hear. Or perhaps, as he hints in the transcript's final moments, knowledge that someone had already heard and deliberately chosen to bury. In the vault, alongside the tape and meticulous notes, lay a fourth item, an unsent telegram dated February 13, 1953, the day after the recording. Addressed to the president of the American Society for Psychical Research in New York City, it contained only 4 words that would have changed everything. We have the signal. In the final recording, perhaps the last he ever made, Arthur Augustus Ford speaks not as a preacher, not as a performer, but as a man who has glimpsed something he can neither prove nor forget. His voice carries the weight of decades, weathered and deliberate, confessing that the experiments had ceased not because they failed, but because they succeeded in ways too disturbing to continue. He refers to what followed as the silence that answered back, a phrase that hangs in the air like smoke from an extinguished flame. He could no longer sleep without hearing it, that signal, low and resonant and persistent, as if something vast and patient had begun to speak and was waiting, eternally waiting, for a reply. He called it the forbidden frequency, not because it was illegal or hidden, but because it violated the very assumptions upon which all our understanding of consciousness is built. We think the mind dies when the brain does, he reasoned, but what if we have it backwards? What if the mind is not the signal at all, but merely the receiver? This reversal, this complete inversion of the materialist model that governs our reality, haunted Ford through his remaining years, like a ghost he could not exorcise. In those final chapters of his life, he withdrew from the public seances that had made him famous, retreated from the spotlights and stages, gave no more lectures to packed auditoriums, avoided the interviews that once sought his voice. Yet in these last recordings, discovered decades later in a basement archive, he leaves behind his most radical and perhaps most dangerous idea, that consciousness may not be generated by the brain at all, but tuned into it, like a wavelength drifting through the cosmic dark. And if that is true, then death is not destruction or ending, or the final silence we have been taught to fear. Death is simply detuning. Ford's voice drops to barely above a whisper as he explains. When you die, the body's radio is smashed beyond repair, but the station keeps broadcasting somewhere in the void, and if you build the right kind of receiver, if you understand the frequencies and the physics of what lies beyond, you can still hear it calling through the static. In the margins of his final manuscript, a work he titled Field Resonance and the Soul, are equations, rough and speculative perhaps, but grounded in real electromagnetic theory that respects the laws of physics even as it reaches towards something beyond them. He proposed that every human being emits an ultra-low frequency field as unique as a fingerprint, as personal as a heartbeat, tied directly to their neurological structure and the patterns of thought that make them who they are. He cited the work of Harold Burr at Yale University, who in the 1940s theorized that electrical fields surrounding living organisms, what he called L fields, could be the organizing blueprint of life itself, the invisible architecture upon which biology builds its cathedrals. Ford extended this theory into darker territory, asking questions that made colleagues uncomfortable. What if those fields persist after the body fails? What if, when death comes, they do not vanish instantly, but decay slowly like radioactive isotopes, releasing stored information, memories, identity, the very essence of self, into the ambient space around us? This was not mysticism or wishful thinking or the desperate grasping of a man afraid to face his own mortality. Ford was attempting to draw a map of the unmappable, to chart territories that exist beyond the reach of our instruments but not beyond the reach of our understanding. He annotated audio waveforms with the precision of a scientist, compared them to electroencephalogram readings, and developed his theory of resonant continuity, a brief window following death where the mind, no longer tethered to neural matter, enters what he called a free field state. A kind of echo rippling through dimensions we cannot see, not eternal, not the paradise promised by religions, but real and measurable and finite. Ford was not alone in questioning the boundaries between life and death, between consciousness and the void. In the same period, in the hushed corridors of the University of Virginia, Ian Stevenson was collecting meticulous case studies of children who claimed to remember past lives. Many of their stories later validated through careful investigation that defied conventional explanation. Simultaneously, in London, a young neurophysiologist named John Eccles was beginning to argue that consciousness could not be fully explained by synaptic transmission alone, that something more mysterious was at work in the theater of human awareness. There was a crack forming in the edifice of materialism, a hairline fracture in the wall that separates science from the supernatural. But no one dared call it a doorway except Ford. In the final minutes of his recorded reflections, his voice barely audible above the hiss of magnetic tape, he observed that we are afraid to ask where voices come from when they speak to us from beyond the grave. We assume that if we cannot measure something with our instruments, it must not exist in any meaningful way. But as Ford reminds us, absence of evidence is not the same as absence of presence, and the universe may be far stranger and more populated than we dare imagine. He revealed that he had been visited repeatedly by unnamed government representatives, men in gray suits who came not to threaten or intimidate, but to listen with uncomfortable intensity and take careful notes. They asked how his receiver worked, what conditions were necessary for clear signal integrity, whether the phenomenon could be targeted or controlled or weaponized. Ford claimed he gave them nothing of value, believing they were not interested in proving the existence of the soul, but in finding ways to exploit human grief for purposes he could not fathom. One line stands out, scratched in pencil in the margin of his notes like a warning or prophecy. When belief becomes surveillance, the soul becomes currency. After Ford's death in 1971, his work was quietly dismantled piece by piece. The church returned to its more comfortable roots in healing and prayer, his collaborators disappeared into other careers, and the only remaining traces of what he called the radio mind were scattered across underground newsletters and fringe publications read by true believers and dismissed by mainstream science. Until now. Until this tape surfaced from forgotten archives. Until this voice, long buried and deliberately silenced, began to speak again across the decades. What are we to make of Arthur Ford's claim that a signal persists after death? That we may not be alone in the cosmic silence, but merely deaf to what it is desperately trying to tell us? Ford ends his message not with conclusions or certainties, but with a question that trembles with possibility and dread. What if life is not the opposite of death at all? What if they are both shadows cast by something else entirely, something vast and incomprehensible that exists beyond our ability to perceive or understand? And then, with one last breath barely captured by failing equipment, a whisper that seems to come from across impossible distances. I hope you will build the receiver. The tape clicks to silence, the reel stops turning, and we are left alone with no answers, only the terrible and beautiful possibility that beneath all the noise and chaos of the universe, a signal waits patiently in the dark, not for our faith or our fear, but simply for us to finally learn how to listen.